Good evening, everyone. Time for episode 27 of Kerr's Rage, part 1 of the Duaredheim Staff Saga by me. Going to start going a little bit back to page 281, the chapter entitled The Dragon's Ridge. So we know the party is now staring down at Dreadmoore Forest, and that's where we'll start. If any of ye be wondering, Kerr said, this forest has many names, but the dwarves call it Dreadmoore. The trees are so thick and vast that sunlight rarely shines upon the forest floor. Few creatures can live there, but those that do are said to be dark and evil indeed. Kalor used the scepter once more, and it still pointed ever north. He somehow sensed that it pointed to some destination beyond the orcs' tribal lands, somewhere deep within the northern reaches. It was a place of glaciers, eternal snow and legends, a region into which none of them had ever gone. You sense that it leads us there, Kerr said, pointing, don't you? There's no way to be sure. I can feel it. Something calls me to those hills, something from the ancient history of my people. The mountain dwarves lived in the northern reaches? It is only a legend. Dwarvencrest is said to lie somewhere in those hills. Dwarvencrest? The fortress of Baldric, grandsire of the dwarves. I see the glimmer in your eyes. Maybe our journey takes us there. Could be, was his reply. Examining his axe, he held it as if listening to voices that only he could hear. When he was seemingly satisfied, he went about inspecting his gear as he always did. Carmen used the precious moments to care for Karina. Her dress was torn, ragged, and her worn shoes were not designed for the cold of winter or the harshness of the trail. Luckily, the injuries that she suffered at the hands of the orcs were minor, and their time riding had allowed her trail-blistered feet to recover somewhat, and the bruises on her wrists to lessen. Carmen gave her the spare set of clothing that she carried. The garments were a little too big, but they were protective and warm. Dow catered to his wife as much as possible, and his spirits had risen to the highest point of their journey. He was together again with his soulmate, and beyond that, everything else seemed minor. They all took guard shifts that night except for Karina. They needed her to recover her strength, for only then could she take part in their work and act in her own defense. Without the comfort of a fire, the nighttime cold was uncomfortable. Caring for their horses, they assembled them in a tight circle about their camp. Relying on their cloaks and blankets, they shared their warmth with the horses. Cold wasn't the only thing that they had to fear, for to the south, they could hear the thunderous rumblings of the orcs' drums, and to the northwest, the answering boom boom of their brethren. They could communicate over long distances with their drums, Tarek said, but even I don't know their full meaning. All that we can know for sure is that they are still close behind us and drawing nearer. Their dinner rations were meager without a cooking fire, but cheese, salted meat, and leftover biscuits seemed like a bountiful meal after their harrowing journey. Tarek brought the horses some still green grass that he found on a south-facing slope, and they seemed content. Settling in among them, he had many questions to ask their new companion. Did you ever see the orcs' commander, or what force drives them? There was one that they all obeyed, always cloaked and riding a giant wolf that reeked of death. His face was always hidden, but he was no orc, nor any kind of goblin that I've ever seen. Did he move about more by day, Kerr asked, or by night? It was strange, but his presence was stronger and more bold in the dark. What are you getting at, Kerr? Carmen asked. He sounds like a dark elf to me. Sunlight torments them. What would a dark elf be doing, leading an army of orcs? They covet power as much as dwarves love gold. Then this could be some Dragonian plot, D'Artagnan said. An alliance with the orcs. How better to wage war on a far distant enemy than to shed the blood of your allies who are already there? This dark elf, our captain, Dal said, may be a sorcerer in search of powerful magic. He may not be Dragonian at all, nor are we certain that he is an elf. But all of the dark elves that we've heard of in this region are Dragonian pirates, Leander said, raiding Firmish vessels off the coast. Remember that before they ruled Dragonia, they were the supreme overlords of Under-Earth. Let's talk no more of it now, Carmen said. We'll find our answers soon enough. And then Kerr drew forth his flask of mushroom wine once more and poured a small cup for each of them. It brought back memories of friends and family in simpler times. That was the magic of the dwarven brew. They spoke and rested until sundown. The guard shifts were set, and in turn, each of them drifted off in weariness. A chilling wind began to blow, and at times a horrible wailing shriek echoed from within the forest. Near to midnight, the horrible cries became the loudest of all. What, in the name of Odin, is that? I've never heard any woodland creature shriek thus, Leander said to him, but it sounds hungry. If we're lucky, Kerr said, it only hunts at night, and will pass it by day. Their conversations continued for a time, but inevitably they all fell asleep despite the dangers. They were simply too tired to do otherwise. The frightening hunting cries of that faceless creature ended at dawn, and were replaced by a silence almost as disturbing. A quick breakfast and respite was all that they could risk. Their enemies were likely close behind them now. Stowing their gear with vigor, they prepared their steeds. Their work warmed them and relieved the stiffness of sleeping on the ground. The morning air smelled of late autumn weather, and most of the trees, save the evergreens, had already lost their leaves. The sky was cloudless, and they spotted several scavenger birds circling above the center of the forest. Descending the mountain slope, they journeyed past the tree line and then beneath the canopy of the dark wood. The strong smells of cedar and acorns tempted them to relax. Tarek was almost lulled into complacency by the forest's spell, but his other senses told him that something was amiss. Scanning the woodland floor, he found no traces of deer, nor of any other animals that should have been there. The only creatures to be seen were a few quick birds flitting about. Something isn't right. What is it? Carmen asked, riding up beside him. If we had the time, I'd recommend that we skirt around this forest. But since we have no choice, we must try to get through it in one day's time. Your senses haven't failed us yet. The animals fear some hunter within. Then we have hunters behind us and ahead. Yet forward we must go. Turning to face the others, she said, we must pass through the forest before nightfall. If we are still under the forest canopy at sundown, we'll be in deadly peril. Deadly peril, says she, Kerr replied. Ever since you joined my squad, all that we've done is face deadly peril. I think that you've got the right of it, Kalar said, but I wouldn't know what to do if it were any different anyway. The Tower of Lycurgus. Tall and gray it stood at the heart of Dreadmoore. Its massive base was surrounded by a wide moat and could be reached only through the use of a long, narrow drawbridge. The keep was a round tower, rising some 100 feet from the forest floor, its topmost battlements overlooking the treetops. Outwardly, it appeared as the massive fortress of a baron or perhaps a wealthy knight, but inside of its walls, its purpose was much more sinister. Its upper floors were home to a host of orcs, protectors of the keep itself, and guardians of their master's work in the dungeons below. For it was there that Lycurgus had built his diabolical laboratory, a home to a madman's experiments, to a genius. His work spanned a wide gamut, from the curious study of natural life to the horrific crossbreeding of creatures large and small. These were his greatest creations, a blend of terrible predators into fierce guardians of the forest around his home. He was responsible for the creation of many legendary horrors, among them the union of lion, ram, and dragon into the terrifying chimera, but perhaps his most terrible amalgamation involved the mingling of the giant owl and cave bear into one horrifying 14-foot-tall juggernaut. Releasing these hell-spawned beasts into the world was the result of his evil work, and more frighteningly, they would all obey his every command. Racing ahead of his army like a panther to the kill, he rode Pestilence, the direst of wolves. The shadows of night cloaked him and his pack as they raced through the hills and descended into the forest. The mighty wolves covered the miles leading to his home with speed and power. No mortals saw them, and few could have. Pausing by the forest's edge, Pestilence howled, and the drawbridge lowered. They raced into the tower's mouth, and the bridge was raised. "Grade, feed the pack, and send the zookeepers to the dungeon." His half-orc butler was loyal and ruthless. He was immediately off to his appointed tasks. "You there," he said, pointing to his orcan guards. "Prepare the cages. Lower them down to the laboratory." In his haste to descend the dungeon stairs, his shadow seemed to lag behind. He was home, and when he was there, his orcs followed his commands without question. He was proud of his red orcs, so much more disciplined and loyal than other goblins. The cacophonies of his animals greeted him as he opened the iron-bound door to his chambers. There was no time to waste, for he was yet unsure of how far his quarry had run into the forest. His wolves were swifter than any horse, but his lead in the race was not great enough for him to relax even a little. If he failed to acquire the device, his pride and his life would both hang in the balance. Once the usurpers entered his forest, they would never leave it alive. In the dark, his marvelous work slept around him. 12-legged arachnids, a hydra hatchling, and goats whose milk yielded a cure for the plague were but a few of them. But he hadn't come to study. His purpose was far more urgent. His master's plan was moving forward, and he intended to rise along with him. Gliding through the maze of cages, work tables, and crucibles, in mortar and pestle, he came at last to his most fearsome creations. Choosing carefully, he had to consider which were the most expendable and most deadly. He picked a pair of his most terrible, savage, and hungry creations. They had finally mated, and a clutch of spotted eggs lay in their nest, 8 in all. If one of them were to die, he could still raise their offspring, and the line of his creations would live on. Chains rattled as the hoist was lowered. Torchlight revealed the zookeepers riding in the cages. The orcs opened their adamant doors and readied poles with nooses and long lanyards. But these things were only necessary in the absence of their master, for the beasts obeyed his will alone. "Come, my children, it is time to hunt." And they shambled out like obedient children, entering their cages and chirping contentedly. "Do not worry about your babies. Daddy will take care of them while you're gone. Now go to the forest and devour any that enter your territory, be they horse or man." They were beasts, but cunning, and his words were not lost on them, for he could communicate with all intelligent things through the power of his mind. "Take care of the animals while I am gone." "Yes, master," the head zookeeper answered. "I must return to the army for a time. Drade will command in my absence." Leaping onto the cages, he shouted above, "Hoist the cages!" And he rode up the shaft like a shadowy demon, his eyes burning with dark fire. Hands upon the great chains, he rode there, even as his orcs hoisted them one by one onto carts and unhooked them. "Across the bridge, my warriors, my right hand. We soon ride into hell, perhaps to death's great glory, but now for the hunt. Open the cages. Go forth, my children. Listen and lurk, rip and rend, devour flesh and bone. Defend the forest. Well done, my soldiers. Our victory is at hand. Pestilence, bring the pack. We run till the dawn." His army still hunted, but they couldn't go with the master for too long. Dreadmoore Forest. Tarek led them swiftly through the immense wood. The towering trees' great boughs shaded the forest floor so completely that few plants grew there. The lack of underbrush allowed the horses room to maneuver, and their pace was little hindered. It was unusually warm, and there was little wind. The trees themselves were enormous, and at times they grew very close together. "How does he know that we're going the right way?" D'Artagnan asked. "These giant trees and their roots blend one into another. There is no difference that I can tell between where we are and where we've come from." "He seems to have some internal compass," Leander said, "and though we twist and turn around boulders and fallen trees, he is somehow able to navigate. I myself use the sun for guidance in the woods, but it is now invisible to us. If we ever get out of here, I'm going to ask him to teach me." When it seemed that half the day was gone, Tarek signaled a halt. There, in a dark clearing, they circled their horses for a meeting. "My senses tell me that we are now near the heart of the wood, but my heart is troubled. I must climb to the top of a tree to gain a new bearing, or we may become lost." "I will climb," Keylor said. "I have the proper equipment, spikes, harness, and rope. A free climb to such a height is too risky." "Very well. You must climb until you can see above the forest roof. Look in all directions and guess how far we've come. Concentrate on the northern mountain range, and remember which side of the tree points thus when you climb down." Keylor climbed the huge cedar quickly. When there was no convenient branches, he used his safety harness and rope to ascend. When he'd reached the top, he was so high up that he could no longer see his friends below. All that he could see were the descending trunks and branches of a myriad of trees all around him. The surrounding spires interlocked their branches in a lattice that Keylor could have used as a bridges from tree to tree. This world above was a wonderland that reminded him of his childhood, but he knew that danger lurked near, and now was not the time for reminiscing. Surveying the forest and all the lands around it, he found himself about midway through the ocean of trees. To the south, he could see the orcs swarming over the same mountain pass that they had traveled over. Apparently their trail hadn't been lost. To the east, he spied a forbidding gray tower jutting above the treetops, but he could see no signs of life from within it. To the north, he saw the orcs' tundra region and their pyramid fortress, and beyond it all, he could see the far-off northern reaches. To the east was a vast sea of trees, and the forest seemed to reach as far as the horizon. He wasted no time in climbing down. "We are halfway through," he said. "The orcs are still on our trail, and the dark tower stands about a mile to the east. We were headed in the right direction." To help guide them, he again called upon the scepter's power, and it pointed the same way. "We must reveal neither torch nor candle flame while we're within the wood. Do not light it again," Tarek said. "I fear what its light may bring." Turning Windrunner, he led them on again, confident that his woodcraft hadn't failed him. Sundown was near as they approached the forest's edge. Vultures were perched in the lowest branches of the trees around them, and the stench of carrion was everywhere. Keylor's necklace had begun to glow with its strange white radiance, and he was beginning to understand what that meant. He tried to hide the light with his cloak's cowl by tucking it beneath his chin, but some radiance still spilled out. Making their way toward the light of freedom, they came upon the remains of an enormous beast, half eaten and torn apart. Tarek could feel eyes upon him, and he knew that the predators were near. "Ride!" he screamed, but it was too late. The misshapen animals were already among them. The monsters rushed out from their hiding places, and they were terrible to behold. 14 feet tall were they, with the thickly muscled torso of a grizzly and the beaked head of some insane predatory bird. Worst of all, with their red-rimmed, nightmarish eyes, half sunken and bestial, oozing some sickly gray ichor. Their bird-like tongues probed about inside their beaks with the anticipation of a fresh meal. Their claws were the long curved talons of the cave bear, and their bodies were stooped like some flightless bird. They were a mockery of all that was natural, and they were the first to strike. Tarek was the first to fall. With but a single blow from one huge paw, the ravenous animal tore him from his seat and brought Windrunner to the ground. Its mate was upon the party's flanks almost as quickly. Kalor and Kerr leaped from their makeshift saddles and tumbled out of the beast's path. The creature tore into their horses in a savage rage, and Kerr's pack-horse fell beneath its onslaught. Despite the ferocity of the ambush, Carmen was able to lead Alger outside of the struggle, while the others dismounted and tried to defend themselves. Karina tried to lead their horses to safety, but they were terrified and uncontrollable. She felt helpless with no weapons to defend herself with. She had no option save flight. Running headlong out of the clearing, she sought shelter behind the trees. Next time they were in danger, she would not be so useless. Dao's bow sung its chorus, and several of his barbed shafts found their marks, but all they seemed to do was to further enrage the beasts. Darton and Leander charged the rearmost animal, and their swords bit deeply into its hind flesh before it turned on them. The monsters attacked whatever was closest to them. The company was in chaos. The battle was a maelstrom of spooked horses, slashing swords, and tearing talons. And that's where we'll end episode 27. Episode 28 will continue the battle at the top of page 291. So thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. Until we meet again, remember to read Kerr's Rage, Part 1 of the Duaredheim Staff Saga, by me, and all the other novels in the series. Thank you and have a great night.